Hello, we are back now for Module 8. This module focuses specifically on the Slave South from 1820 to 1860. The first thing we'll see is that there isn't just one American South in this era. I've really divided it up. Historians generally divide it up into three sections. The Upper South, so states like Virginia, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and so on. Kind of the Middle South, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and the Lower South, basically South Carolina to Texas. And in each of these different regions, the economies were more or less dependent on slaves. So for example, the Virginia economy, largely resting on tobacco cultivation, was much less dependent on slavery than South Carolina's economy, which as a graph, actually I give you a lot of graphs and maps in this PowerPoint, and one of those graphs, hopefully it really raises eyebrows. You'll get a sense of how each of the states differed in the proportion of slaves that they had, and you'll notice the Lower South, by and large, had, if not just as many slaves than free whites, oftentimes more slaves than free whites. South Carolina really stands out here, as well as Mississippi and Alabama. Another map a map on this PowerPoint really gives you a sense of what is being grown, what the economies rest on in the South, and what should stand out to you immediately. And this is something you'll remember from the colonial period that hasn't changed much in the intervening century, is that the Southern economy is predominantly agricultural, right? Producing everything from hemp to tobacco to timber to rice. What we'll talk about quite a bit right now is cotton. During these same years, by contrast, in the North, the northern economy is industrializing, right? Making canals, it's making steel, it's doing all kinds of different construction, it's urbanizing, its population is growing massively. In the South, the population is largely static. And whereas immigration really starts to hit the North, really kind of diversifying the population by the 1840s, 1850s, in the South, immigration doesn't really come to the region. It's largely a black and white society between free whites and enslaved blacks. Another map in this PowerPoint will give you a sense of where the urban centers, the large cities, were in the United States. And hopefully what you'll notice is, with the exception of probably about 5 different cities, probably Memphis, New Orleans, Richmond, Charleston, maybe a few others, with the exception of those 4 to 5 cities, most large urban centers were in the North. The state of Massachusetts alone, Massachusetts and New York, those 2 states alone, probably had more industrial capacity than almost the entire South combined, right? Now, this isn't necessarily to say that Southerners were inherently retrograde and not forward-thinking, but this is where the logic of slavery really comes in. Cotton as a crop becomes very important during the first half of the 1800s. A big boon to this crop was the creation of what was called the cotton engine in 1790, called the cotton gin for short. This was invented by a northerner named Eli Whitney, which systemized the removal of seeds from raw cotton. There's a picture of an early type of cotton gin in this PowerPoint. Before the cotton gin, a slave would have to pick off raw cotton and by hand pick out all the little sharp needle seeds inside raw cotton. Very time-consuming process. Well, Whitney's invention now takes that very time-consuming process and makes it done within minutes, right? You just put the raw cotton in, turn the wheel, and it just removes those seeds. Not coincidentally, cotton production skyrockets during the early 1800s. Another map on this PowerPoint will show you just how that happens. Cotton is, as opposed to other cash crops of the South, rice in particular, sugar and so on, these are very capital-intensive industries. In other words, you can't just start cultivating rice. You need capital investment. You need machines. In other words, you need kind of a hefty nest egg to get involved in the business, right? You need machines. You need to be on a coast, especially with rice. You need low tidewater regions to cultivate that crop. By contrast, cotton is very durable, can be cultivated largely anywhere, wherever there's plenty of sun. And, you can do it whether you only own 1 acre of land. You can do it whether you own 1,000 acres of land. And so during one of the dramas of the early 1800s is that cotton cultivation is spreading throughout the South. And what you'll notice in that same map that I just mentioned is cotton cultivation is followed by slave expansion. The international slave trade is outlawed in 1808. One of the few compromises against slavery during the writing of the Constitution was the ending of the international slave trade. It said it would be ended in 1808, and that happens. Now, of course, slavery does not end. What happens after 1808, first of all, before 1808, the international slave trade wasn't that important for North American slavery. Most slaves, the slave population reproduced itself, right? So you didn't have to have constant reinfusions of slaves. Slaves just reproduced themselves. And because of this, it wasn't a big hit to slave markets when the international slave trade ended. What happens after 1808 is that the domestic trade of slaves booms, right? So you start to see slave markets in most southern towns and cities, right? So you'd go to New Orleans, Memphis, Charleston, Washington, D.C., for that matter. You'd be walking down the street, you see all these different shops, right? For clothing, general store, a livery stable, in other words, stuff for horses. And then you'd come to your slave store, your slave market, right? This is where you'd go into to see the latest offerings of slaves if you wanted to buy anybody. I have a couple images on this PowerPoint that gives you a sense of what that might have looked like. It's hard for us to imagine, but the sale of human property was a multi-million-dollar industry in the American South. It's staggering to think. But during these years, the 1840s, 1850s, the single most valuable economic commodity, much more valuable than banks, than all industries in the U.S. economy, the single most valuable commodity was the slave. They fetched high prices and they had a lot of value. I want you to think about, as you're contemplating these issues, how slaves had different values based on their ages and sex. I want you to think about why would teenage slaves, so let's say a young woman of 18, why would she be more valuable than an older woman? More expensive is a way to put it. Why would the most expensive slave be a young man in his mid-20s? Why would the least expensive slaves be older slaves? Why would a slave with whip markings on his back why would he be priced less because of that? Okay, so I want you to think about those things. In other words, in the decades before the Civil War, slavery was not becoming a retrograde, obsolete economic system. It was becoming more and more valuable, and that's because cotton was booming. The Industrial Revolution was in full tilt by the 1840s, and American cotton was feeding the textile mills of Europe, largely Britain and France. And so as cotton cultivation is growing, slavery is growing. Many southern planters are looking at the North and they're saying, yes, industrialization is happening, immigration is happening, urbanization is happening. But here, as one of my slides will highlight, cotton is king. Cotton makes us a lot of money. We have no need to industrialize. All we need is a continuous resupply of land. This gets us back to a theme that I addressed in the last module. I had to kind of rush that one in to fit it into 15 minutes, but by the late 1840s, by the end of the Mexican-American War, the United States is a whole new range of territory in the West. But the question is, should slavery be allowed to expand out there? Right? We've already talked about the Missouri Compromise. We'll see that those issues will continue to embroil American politics. That'll be a topic for the next module. But one of the pressures on American planters is, you just do kind of basic farming, that when you continuously are using a plot of land and don't allow it to kind of regerminate, eventually that land will be exhausted, right? So in other words, by the 1820s, many farmers in South Carolina, for example, have exhausted their land. Where do they go? Many of them are going to Texas. Many of them are those same Southerners that I mentioned that caused that crisis with Mexico in the 1830s, right? And so for many Southerners, they start to say, we have a good economic system here. It's been working for us for now. Just remember back to our earlier modules. Now here we are 200 years after the founding of Virginia. It's been working for 2 centuries. Many Southern planters start to resent this abolitionist movement in the North that I mentioned in the last module. And they start to say, look, it's our constitutional right to own property. Slaves are property. Of course, abolitionists will start to argue, well, slaves are inherently humans just like we are. Most Americans wouldn't have agreed with that, and even if they would have said, yes, slavery is reprehensible, blacks aren't necessarily equal to whites. Anyway, those are conversations for the next module. For our purposes here, what we see in the South is an economy and a Southern white population that, regardless of their socioeconomic background, are committed to maintaining slavery. Let's talk about socioeconomic backgrounds. Southern white society was divided by class. It is relatively a small percentage of Southern whites who owned slaves, probably less than 10% who owned slaves. Now, people involved in the slave trade who were connected to slavery, that percentage would go up. But in other words, in short, most American whites did not own slaves. Okay? And those who did were usually the wealthiest citizens in their counties, in their communities, in their states, and so on. They had these huge estates, these huge plantations. They often owned 50 to 100 slaves. The very wealthy would own maybe 200 to 300. They would have been the very wealthy 1%. Middle-class whites of the South might own maybe 2 to 3 slaves. Maybe if they couldn't own slaves, they would rent them from larger planters, right? But their aspiration, if you were a middle-class white person in the South in the antebellum period, your aspiration was to be a wealthy landowner. And to be a wealthy landowner, you had to own slaves. There were poor whites as well. These would have been the class of Southern white society that resented blacks the most, perhaps, because they were the ones who would have been most threatened by the ending of slavery, because they would have been felt the most competition for jobs from poor Southern blacks. So in other words, regardless of where a Southern white was on the socioeconomic ladder, and regardless to a certain degree of whether they owned slaves directly or not, most Southern whites would have said slavery is a good thing that should be maintained. How was slavery maintained? The short answer is brute force. One of the documents in this chapter in the RIP book will highlight how that is done. Going back to the domestic trade of slavery, ways in which slaves were punished were various ways, whether it's whippings, brandings, things like this. Oftentimes, selling off family members was a way to punish a slave. How did slaves resist? Passive ways, pretending to be sick, laming animals on the plantation. The most common form of resistance was running away, but it was very precarious. If you're a slave and you leave your plantation, where do you go? Everyone out there is looking for you, right? State militias, federal troops would be sent out to capture runaway slaves. So running away was very precarious, and when you were caught, you knew you'd be punished, or your family members might be sold away as a form of punishment. On very few occasions were there rebellions. I've highlighted 4 of them in this PowerPoint. They all fizzle into nothing. Most of them will be broken up quite early in their stages. Most of them will see maybe a few score of whites killed in a huge outburst of violence, but it doesn't come close to ever ending the slavery system. Slavery, we cannot overstate enough, was a system of exploitation. It was also a system that created massive economic wealth that gave Southern whites no incentive to change. And we can, it's a chicken and egg question. What came first, the racism that led to the slavery, or the slavery that led to the racism? For our purposes here, we get a sense that going into the Civil War period, we have an American South that is committed to maintaining slavery and the way of life and prosperity that comes along with it.